We also took a snapshot of the special education programs in the two districts, and one of the things that we always look at are the number of youngsters that are identified as in need of special educational services in each of the districts involved in a study of this sort, which we have done here. As you can see, we took a look at a snapshot of just a two-year look for each district. And these are the state-defined and federal-defined possible categories of youngsters with special educational needs. And we look at this table primarily to get a bottom line percentage of youngsters that each district has identified out of the total student population as in need of special educational services, because this tells us a couple of things. Number one, and most importantly, it tells us a little bit about the philosophy of your committees on special education and your preschool committees on special education. It tells about how they view the referrals that come to them and how many youngsters they ultimately recommend to you as a board are identified as in need of special educational services. Now, the state of New York says, on average, most districts should have about 12% of their population that are youngsters identified in need of special educational services. So when we took a look at your two districts for at least these 2 years, we found that in Romulus, it's, as you can see, 15 to 17% of the population has been identified as in need of special ed services, and it's a little bit higher in South Seneca, 18 to 21%. Okay? So we look at those in relation to the state's recommendations, but even more importantly, in terms of the percentages across your two districts, because it again speaks to the philosophy of the individuals that sit around the table and make these recommendations that you as boards ultimately approve at your board meetings. And there's a fair amount of similarity there in terms of the overall percentages of youngsters your two districts identify. I don't think it's unusual, having been a special ed director myself, to see a little bit higher percentage in South Seneca than in Romulus, although again the numbers, with small numbers, percentages can be misleading. But only because of, again, socioeconomic differences, and we know there's a correlation there as well. Our recommendation as it relates to special education is that immediately after a merger, a new Board of Education will have to appoint, as you do currently at your annual reorganization meetings, a new Committee on Special Education and a new Preschool Committee on Special Education. And we think it's important that the new Board of Education that appoints these two committees at its first reorganizational meeting try to appoint members that are currently sitting on your existing committees in about equal number. And for a couple of reasons. Number one, there will be somebody sitting around the table that knows each one of the youngsters who will have to be annually reviewed. They'll have some history of those youngsters and their family and so forth, and that's really important for those children. And secondly, it ensures that there's some continuity of programming and philosophy from the two pre-existing committees on special ed or preschool committee on special ed. So we believe that that's an important recommendation as it relates to those children. Another major part of our study, you may recall, if you attended some of the advisory committee meetings, dealt with the school facilities. And we took a look at several different aspects of the school facilities, including their overall status in terms of structural status, as well as space availability and so forth. And what we found when we took a look at the most recent 5-year building condition surveys for the two districts, and I would say that Romulus's, when we took a look at it, was from 2010, and South Seneca's was a 2012 building condition survey. We found that both districts now have their facilities in quite good shape. I will point out that, I get the right pointer here. that at the time of the building condition survey in Romulus, it was overall rated as unsatisfactory, but recent capital work has changed that, and most of that work has been done to address that particular rating. There are still a few things that need to be done, such as sidewalks, playground, pavement, and athletic fields, at least the last time that we examined this. But for the most part, our conclusion, our finding is that both districts have done a good job trying to maintain the facilities, and for the most part, they're in good shape. We also did an analysis of the space available, because this is important since we need to come up with a recommendation ultimately, which we have, for what grades ought to be housed in which building, and could a building be closed, for example, and so forth. So we took a look at the available space, and we did that a number of different ways. First of all, we didn't do a detailed, room-by-room space analysis, because declining enrollments in both districts really didn't dictate that we really needed to do that. And the stable future enrollments, or even slightly declining under a merge scenario, says that there is adequate space in the buildings. In 2011-12, for example, when we took a snapshot, we found that South Seneca housed grades 9 through 12, and it had 363 youngsters in the building. If the districts had merged, rather, in 2011-12, and all 9 through 12 were housed in South Seneca, it would be 363 children. And there was actually 371 in 7 through 12 that year. So if South Seneca were the combined district's high school, it could adequately, we believe, house those youngsters as it did for 7 through 12 in 2011-12. And also in 2006-07, South Seneca had 530 kids in the building. So clearly there's space in that building to house a combined high school for the two districts. Romulus in 2011-12, if the districts had merged, we took a look at what a 6-8 middle school might look like, combined of the two districts, and there would have been 275 kids in the building. It actually had 190 for grades 7 through 12 in that year. In a period by period, we did an in-depth period by period analysis. We showed that it could fit, even though the numbers on the surface don't look like it. And you'll see that detailed analysis, if you haven't already, in the written report. So the conclusion is that there is adequate room in the secondary schools, with the high school, combined high school under a merger scenario being in South Seneca, a 6-8 middle school being in Romulus, and keeping the elementaries open. And we don't believe that even despite the declining enrollment, the districts could adequately house all of the youngsters and close a building. So we think that all the buildings are going to be needed now and in the immediate future if our enrollment projections play out for the next several years. And it could accommodate a 6-8 middle, 9-12 high school, as I've said, with elementaries in the communities. Boards of Education, as you know, you have policies on who can use your buildings, so we took a quick look at that. And you can see the list of organizations that use your various facilities. This is important because they're community owned. Community pays for them, and most boards of education, like your two boards, feel that the community ought to have access to them outside of just the regular education program that's offered there for your community's children. And you can see from the number of groups that use your buildings, that's the case. You do that like most districts. So our recommendation is that the new Board of Education should take a look at the two existing policies that you have on the books in terms of external use of the buildings, and develop a policy that is consistent and will accommodate both of the existing policies. And we don't see that as being a problem, because you both of your districts open your schools to your community groups. And our 12th recommendation, as we've already spoken to, is that the grade arrangement should be K-5, 6-8, 9, 12 in the buildings that we've already spoken about. Once we make some determination about where the buildings are and the grades that will be housed in each one of those buildings, we work with the committee and the transportation directors to take a look at what's the best way to get youngsters to and from school and the most reasonable way to do that. But we also took a look at the current transportation operations in the two districts. One of the things we started with was taking a look at the bus fleets that each of the districts has. And there's a little bit of difference in the sense that, Romulus contracts out its maintenance and has done so since 2005. South Seneca does its own maintenance in district. And I would also mention that Romulus has a bus replacement program, and South Seneca has a bus replacement program as well. South Seneca is about every 5 years. Romulus replaces buses about every 30,000 miles or 10, 11 years, whichever comes first. So both districts make an effort through their bus replacement plan to try to keep their fleets up to date. And I think you can see that from the conditions at least in this one table that shows South Seneca's fleet, and you'll see a similar thing in the report for Romulus, that both districts keep their fleet in pretty good shape. The state recommends, although it's not required, that youngsters should not be on the bus ideally more than an hour. But honestly, that does happen in many districts. I will tell you, as I've shared with the committee, I know we've done work up in the North Country, and some of those districts are enormous up there. And some kids are on a bus much longer than an hour. But the state generally recommends that an hour is the ideal maximum time youngsters should be on the bus. And what we found is that there's some out-of-district runs where youngsters can be on the bus more than an hour, but in district, it's for both districts, it's an hour or less. Our second 20-second finding is that Romulus has a single bus run, while South Seneca has a double bus run. And what that means is all the youngsters in Romulus are picked up together when the buses go out and bring them into school, and they're all taken home together, whereas South Seneca sends the buses out and picks up the secondary kids, and then sends the buses out a second time and picks up the elementary. So it's 2 bus runs versus 1 bus run. Sometimes, I've worked in school districts myself where we've actually changed the number of runs and so forth. And there's advantages and disadvantages to whether you do single tripping or double tripping, as it's sometimes known. But that's how it's currently done in the 2 districts. And we got the 2 transportation directors together to talk about their current programs, and we even asked them, and they graciously came and presented to the committee one evening to talk about the bus runs and how they're arranged in the 2 districts. And I want to make sure that we thank them for their time to do that.